You belong to me for 1 month, and that's non-negotiable." The cold billionaire's voice echoed in the dark penthouse, his eyes locking onto hers with a dangerous intensity. "I'll do anything. Just save her," she whispered, desperation shaking every word. He stepped closer, his presence suffocating, low and calm. "Don't think you understand what you've agreed to. 1 night, 1 contract, 1 choice that would change everything." Then came the revelation that shattered her world. Pregnant, with twins. Fear, betrayal, and forbidden desire collided as he refused to let go. "You think you can walk out with my children and I'll just watch?" he growled, his control and obsession igniting a storm she could no longer resist. Secrets, lies, and a love she never expected. Would she survive or surrender completely? Welcome back to Beyond Color Stories. I'm so glad you're here. I want to know, where are you listening to me from today? Drop it in the comments because I love hearing from all of you. And while you're at it, I'm curious, how would you rate my story out of 10? Be honest, I really want to know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss any of our amazing stories. All right, let's dive in. The rain assaulted the cracked window of Damien Cross's office with an aggression that felt almost personal, as if the sky itself was punishing Alina for the decision she was about to make. The dim lamp on the desk cast a weak pool of light that barely illuminated her trembling hands, the pen lying before her like a weapon aimed at her last shred of dignity. Every corner of the room smelled faintly of expensive leather and ruthless decisions, the kind of atmosphere created by a man who built empires by crushing obstacles without blinking. Across from her sat Damien, unmoving, his presence filling the room in a way that felt heavier than the storm outside. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't even pretend to. His gaze was sharp, cold, and disturbingly calm as he watched her battle the weight of the contract, and yet in the stillness of his expression there was something almost too controlled, as if he had mastered the art of hiding every flicker of emotion long before she ever walked into his world. Alina swallowed hard, her throat raw with fear and exhaustion, because signing this paper meant surrendering herself, her body, her time, her freedom, to a man who didn't believe in mercy. But her mother's frail face flashed in her mind, the weak smile she forced in the hospital bed, the way her breathing hitched in pain. The doctor's words replayed like broken glass inside her skull. "If we wait, she won't survive." And so Alina whispered the words she never imagined she would utter to any man, let alone someone like Damien Cross. "I'll do anything. Just save her." Damien didn't lean forward. He didn't soften. He didn't even blink. Instead, he gave her the most devastatingly calm answer possible, a quiet verdict delivered with the confidence of a man who was used to people breaking under his decisions. "Then you belong to me for 1 month." No pause, no hesitation, no trace of conscience. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended above her, and something inside her cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, but deeply, painfully. Alina lowered her eyes to the contract once more, her vision blurring as her fingers closed around the pen. She felt every ounce of her pride draining out of her as she signed her name, the ink dragging across the paper with the weight of a woman surrendering the last thing she had left, herself. The rain outside thundered, as if marking the exact moment her life diverged from everything she once dreamed of. When she was done, she placed the pen down so slowly it was as if letting go of it might shatter her completely. Damien stood, his movements controlled to an unnerving degree, and though he kept his face blank, the moment she turned away, something sharp flashed through his eyes. A brief, unwanted reaction he shoved down instantly. She didn't see the way his jaw tightened, or the way his fingers curled slightly against his palm, betraying a discomfort he couldn't quite name. But he felt it, and he hated it. Alina walked toward the elevator with steps that barely held her together, each breath tight in her chest, her heart pounding with a dread she tried desperately to silence. She had told herself she could endure anything for her mother. She had repeated that mantra until it became a shield she clung to. But the reality of standing in Damien Cross's presence, his cold authority, his silent intensity, had shaken her far more than she wanted to admit. As the elevator ascended toward his penthouse, the walls seemed to close in around her, reflecting the faint, distorted version of herself. A woman who had just traded her freedom for the chance to save the only person she cared about. When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped into the luxurious hallway, the polished marble chilling beneath her feet as she approached the suite she was now bound to. Each step felt like crossing deeper into a world she didn't belong to, a world built by a man whose very name carried power, fear, and an aura that threatened to swallow her whole. Her hands were cold, her breath uneven. Yet beneath the fear was something else, something she refused to acknowledge, a strange pull toward the very man who now owned a month of her life. The penthouse was breathtaking, a vast space overlooking the storm-lit cityscape, filled with quiet luxury and an eerie stillness that made her skin prickle. She walked slowly inside, trying to steady her racing pulse, telling herself she needed to stay numb, stay detached, stay untouched by anything except the purpose of the contract. But before she could swallow her nerves, she sensed him enter behind her. Damien didn't announce himself. He didn't clear his throat or speak. He simply stepped into the room, and his presence alone shifted the air so sharply her shoulders tensed. She turned to find him watching her, not with lust, not with sympathy, but with an unreadable intensity that made her heart pound harder than fear alone could explain. He walked toward her with slow, controlled steps, the kind of movement that didn't need force to intimidate because the quiet power behind it was more than enough. Alina felt her breathing falter as he stopped just close enough that she could sense the warmth radiating from him, his shadow merging with hers on the polished floor. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence was an intrusion deep enough to make her knees weaken. And then came his voice, low, measured, and devastatingly calm. "Don't think you understand what you've agreed to." His words sliced through the fragile shield she had been trying to build around herself, leaving her exposed to a tension she didn't have the strength or experience to navigate. She tried to steady her breath, but the moment she looked into his eyes, she felt her resolve crumble in ways she couldn't rationalize. His gaze held calculation, yes, but behind it was something darker, heavier, restrained, yet dangerous. Something that warned her that Damien Cross was not a man who lived within boundaries, and certainly not a man who honored them once broken. She didn't know what exactly she'd stepped into, but she felt, deep in her bones, that this deal was not just a transaction, not just a temporary sacrifice. Something in his eyes told her that their lives had already begun to intertwine in ways neither of them expected. And the worst part was that a small, terrified part of her wasn't sure she wanted to run from it. The scene ended on that silent collision, his cold, calculating eyes locked onto the unsteady rise and fall of her breath. Two strangers bound by desperation, drawn by something neither understood, standing on the very edge of a storm that had nothing to do with the rain outside. The echo of Damien's warning still clung to the air like a physical force, the room frozen around them as Alina tried to steady the tremor in her breath. His eyes had locked onto her as if he were dissecting every flicker of hesitation, every rise and fall of her chest, every unspoken fear she tried to bury beneath the weight of her decision. She remained still long after he stepped back, long after the atmosphere eased by only a fraction, because she couldn't shake the sensation that something in him had shifted, just a little, but enough to unsettle the very balance she had walked into this penthouse trying to maintain. When he finally turned and left the room, shutting the door behind him with controlled softness, Alina exhaled the breath she didn't realize she had been holding. But instead of relief, her chest tightened even more because she had seen it. For a split second, buried behind Damien Cross's ruthless composure, there had been something that didn't align with the fearsome reputation she had braced herself for, something she couldn't yet decipher, but something real enough to follow her like a shadow as she moved deeper into the penthouse. The space was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't just the silence of expensive insulation or the hum of automated heating. It felt like the kind of silence built by a man who lived with ghosts, who pushed away everything that threatened to draw emotion from him, who protected the walls around his life as fiercely as he protected the walls inside his chest. Alina walked into the living area, her pulse unsteady as though her body sensed danger, while her mind whispered a warning she didn't want to acknowledge. She expected him to ignore her tonight, to maintain the cold boundaries she had mentally prepared for. She rehearsed the possibility of being treated like a transaction, something to be used and discarded without acknowledgement. But before she could fully settle into that grim expectation, she heard footsteps behind her, slow, steady, but lacking the edge of dominance she had felt earlier. She turned slightly, unsure whether she was ready for another collision of intensity, but what she saw instead disarmed her far more deeply than any threat could. Damien Cross stood by the kitchen island, not looming, not commanding, but strangely still. His tie was loosened, his sleeves pushed up in a way that felt almost vulnerable for a man who lived inside immaculate control. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at her at first. Instead, he reached for a glass, filled it with water, and then, without ceremony, without calculation, walked toward her and placed it gently into her hands. No assistant, no order, no cold distance. He did it himself. The act was small, but something about it struck with a force that tightened her throat. This was a man who didn't do unnecessary gestures. This was a man who didn't serve anyone. And yet here he was, placing water in her hands as if the storm in her chest mattered even if he pretended it didn't. But what unsettled her more wasn't the gesture. It was his hand. His fingers brushed hers, and she felt the slightest tremor. A barely noticeable shake, the kind that came not from weakness, but from internal chaos. The second he sensed, she noticed. The space was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't just the silence of expensive insulation or the hum of automated heating. It felt like the kind of silence built by a man who lived with ghosts, who pushed away everything that threatened to draw emotion from him, who protected the walls around his life as fiercely as he protected the walls inside his chest. Alina walked into the living area, her pulse unsteady, as though her body sensed danger, while her mind whispered a warning she didn't want to acknowledge. She expected him to ignore her tonight, to maintain the cold boundaries she had mentally prepared for. She rehearsed the possibility of being treated like a transaction, something to be used and discarded without acknowledgement. But before she could fully settle into that grim expectation, she heard footsteps behind her, slow, steady, but lacking the edge of dominance she had felt earlier. She turned slightly, unsure whether she was ready for another collision of intensity, but what she saw instead disarmed her far more deeply than any threat could. Damien Cross stood by the kitchen island, not looming, not commanding, but strangely still. His tie was loosened, his sleeves pushed up in a way that felt almost vulnerable for a man who lived inside immaculate control. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at her at first. Instead, he reached for a glass, filled it with water, and then, without ceremony, without calculation, walked toward her and placed it gently into her hands. No assistant, no order, no cold distance. He did it himself. The act was small, but something about it struck with a force that tightened her throat. This was a man who didn't do unnecessary gestures. This was a man who didn't serve anyone. And yet here he was, placing water in her hands, as if the storm in her chest mattered, even if he pretended it didn't. But what unsettled her more wasn't the gesture. It was his hand. His fingers brushed hers, and she felt the slightest tremor, a barely noticeable shake, the kind that came not from weakness, but from internal chaos. The second he sensed she noticed, he withdrew quickly, slipping his hand behind his back, his expression sharpening into the cold facade he used to shield himself. The silence that followed was thick, charged, almost suffocating. Alina stared at the glass, unable to form words, and when she dared look at him again, she caught something flicker in his eyes, a crack in the armor he kept welded shut. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough to shift the ground beneath her feet, enough to make her question everything she thought she knew about him. He walked past her, but not with the usual confidence of a man who dominated every room he entered. Tonight, his steps carried a quiet tension, as though he was wrestling something inside himself, something he didn't want her to see. Alina turned slightly, following him with her eyes. He sensed it. He stopped. And then he looked at her. Only a second, only a breath. But it was different this time. Not cold, not dismissive, not mechanical. His gaze held a weight that made her chest clench, as though he was waging a silent war between pushing her away and being unable to look anywhere else. The wall he had built around himself, constructed from money, power, ruthlessness, and distance, shifted, and for the briefest moment she saw it crack. When she stepped closer without fully meaning to, the space between them tightened. Damien didn't move away. His jaw tensed, his breathing slowed. She reached to set the glass on the table, their hands brushing again, and this time the reaction was unmistakable. His pulse surged, a sharp involuntary jump that traveled through his fingertips and straight into her skin. Alina froze. He cursed under his breath, so quietly she barely heard it, but the frustration wasn't directed at her, it was directed at himself. Damien Cross, the man who intimidated entire boardrooms into silence, the man who made deals worth millions without blinking, looked shaken, and the moment she realized it, his expression hardened in a way that told her he hated how transparent that split second had been. He stepped back abruptly, turning away as if distance could erase what just happened. "Go rest," he said, his voice firm but not cruel, not cold, not detached, just strained, controlled, and carrying weight he didn't want to explain. Alina nodded without speaking, because words felt dangerous now, too fragile in the charged air between them. She made her way to the guest room, lying on the bed with her thoughts spinning in uncontrolled circles. She wasn't trembling from fear anymore. She was trembling from confusion, from the realization that Damien Cross was not the man she assumed he was, not the man the world saw, not the man she expected to face tonight, and that terrified her far more deeply, because this unplanned depth, this unpredictable vulnerability, could break her in ways the contract never warned her about. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but every time she exhaled, she replayed the moment his fingers had trembled, the moment his pulse betrayed him, the moment his eyes softened before he tore the softness away. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. She couldn't tell. She only knew the storm outside had grown heavier, thunder rumbling like a mirror of the tension swirling inside her. She told herself she needed to sleep, to regain strength, to keep her distance. But then she heard the faint creak of the door. Her heart lurched. She kept her eyes closed, unsure whether he was checking on her or simply passing by. But he wasn't passing by. Damien stepped into the room, quietly, carefully, as if he was afraid of waking something more than just her. Alina kept her breathing steady, pretending to sleep, but her pulse betrayed her, racing beneath the blanket. She felt the shift of the air as he approached, felt the weight of his presence at her bedside, and when she finally risked opening her eyes a fraction, she saw something that made her chest tighten with confusing warmth. Damien holding a blanket, not tossing it, not leaving it by the door, but unfolding it with slow, deliberate care, as if this tiny act carried more weight than he wanted to admit. He leaned down and draped it over her with a gentleness that contradicted everything he had ever projected. The blanket brushed her shoulders, and his fingers grazed her arm, soft, unintentional, but full of a tenderness she could feel even through the fabric. He didn't pull away immediately. He lingered just a heartbeat too long, staring at her with an expression that wasn't cold, wasn't guarded, wasn't calculated. It was conflicted, human, painfully vulnerable. "You're not here to suffer," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper, as if admitting it aloud broke some rule he had lived by for years. Then, almost as if realizing what he had just allowed himself to say, he straightened sharply, cleared his throat, and walked out with rigid, almost defensive steps. The door closed behind him, leaving the room dim and silent once more, except now the silence was different, thick with unspoken tension, heavy with a shift neither of them had intended. Alina clutched the blanket he left behind, gripping it as if it were the only proof that she hadn't imagined softness from a man who wasn't supposed to have any. And that realization, more than the contract, more than the debt, more than the fear, made her tremble. Because a cold man was predictable, a ruthless man was survivable, but a man capable of tenderness, a man who could break his own rules, a man who showed vulnerability he didn't want her to see. That was the danger she wasn't prepared for, and that terrified her more than anything. 3. Alina stands frozen in the dimly lit guest room, still holding the blanket Damien placed over her hours ago, the warmth of his unexpected tenderness still lingering on her skin like a quiet shock she cannot process when footsteps echo faintly outside the door. The same restrained, rhythmic steps she has begun to recognize as his, the steps of a man who maintains control over everything except whatever he feels around her. She tightens her grip on the fabric and listens, unsure whether she wants him to pass by or enter, unsure which possibility frightens her more. The handle moves but doesn't fully turn, as if Damien touched it, then changed his mind, and the hesitation sends a ripple of confusion through her. She had expected indifference, coldness, a transactional world where emotions didn't exist, not this jittering line between wanting connection and running from it. When the footsteps retreat, Alina exhales, forcing herself to get up, draping the blanket neatly on the bed, even though her hands tremble at the memory of how softly he laid it over her. A memory she knows she shouldn't hold on to. She steps out into the hallway, expecting emptiness, but instead finds Damien in the living room, jaw tight, shoulders rigid, pretending to read documents he hasn't turned in the last 10 minutes, his eyes flicking up the moment he senses her presence, though he forces them back down as if punishing himself for noticing her at all. The room feels colder than last night, though the temperature hasn't changed. The tension crackling in the air makes her uneasy, especially because she knows this shift is not about power. It's about fear, a fear she cannot yet name. Damien remains seated, but his silence feels like the quiet before a storm, his fingers curled slightly on the armrest, as if something inside him wants to reach for her, while something else commands him to hold still. Alina forces herself to speak, though her voice comes out softer than intended, telling him she can handle distance if that's what he wants, but his reaction is nothing like she expects. His eyes lift sharply, almost wounded, as if her attempt at self-protection hits him somewhere he's been trying to guard all his life. Instead of responding, he stands and walks past her with quick, controlled steps. But she notices the tightness in his shoulders, the way his breath deepens, the way his composure trembles just enough for her to see the cracks that weren't there before. He moves to the huge window overlooking the city and stands there, staring at the distant lights, fists slowly tightening at his sides. She approaches hesitantly, stopping a few feet behind him, unsure if she should speak or leave him alone, but something in his posture feels like a battle he's losing internally. Finally, in a voice low and rough, he asks her without turning around, Why did you choose me? The question catches her off guard. She expected accusations, coldness, but not this heavy, vulnerable confusion. She answers honestly because lying feels pointless in this moment, telling him she chose him because he was the only man powerful enough to save her mother and cruel enough to accept a deal no decent man would. The silence that follows twists the air sharply. Damien's chest rises and falls once, a reaction she didn't anticipate, as if her words cut deeper than any insult aimed at him before. Instead of snapping, instead of retreating into the cold CEO she met that first night, Damien turns slowly, and what she sees in his eyes unsettles her. Not anger, but something close to hurt, something that reveals he is not as untouchable as he pretends. He steps closer, one deliberate step at a time, each one heavy with tension he's trying and failing to suppress. When he reaches her, he lifts his hand, hesitates for a fraction of a second, then brushes his fingers lightly along her cheek. The touch is so gentle it almost breaks her, not because it is romantic, but because it contradicts everything she believed about him, because it makes her realize the man she made this deal with is not just ruthless or cold. He is a maze of contradictions she is not ready to navigate. Damien stares at her like he's trying to understand something he's never had to face before, something he doesn't know how to control, and just when she feels the space between them shift dangerously, he pulls back abruptly, jaw clenching, eyes hardening with a panic he tries to mask with anger. He murmurs, "This is dangerous. You need to stay away from me." His voice not cold, but conflicted, tortured, as if he's warning her about himself, not her choices. The words sting, deeper than she wants to admit, so she steps back, holding on to the last thread of pride she has left, and turns toward the door, determined not to let him see her breaking. She walks with firm steps, but her chest aches, and she hates that she cares, hates that she's reacting to a man who should be nothing more than the owner of her time for 1 month. When she reaches the door and grabs the handle, the moment feels like a final boundary, the line between protecting herself and letting this connection destroy her. She begins to pull the door open, but before she can take a single step, Damien moves faster than she thought he could. His hand wraps around her wrist, warm, firm, trembling slightly, and the shock of his touch sends a violent shiver up her arm. She turns sharply, expecting anger or dominance, but instead finds his expression shattered in a way she has never seen before, his eyes dark with something raw and unguarded. His voice breaks, actually breaks, when he whispers, "Don't go." And the chapter ends on that moment, her hand frozen on the handle, his grip tightening as if he's afraid she'll disappear. Two people stranded between desire, fear, obligation, and something far more dangerous, something neither of them has the courage to name yet. 4. Alina stands frozen with her hand still on the door handle, Damien's grip closing around her wrist with a desperation he's clearly trying to hide, yet failing miserably. His voice still echoes in the hall, that raw, unguarded, "Don't go," and the words hang between them like a fragile thread, pulling them back toward the night that changed everything. For a moment they both remain completely still, breath shallow, hearts beating too fast for two people who should have been nothing but a contract and a deadline. Yet here they are, trapped in a silence filled with emotions neither of them wants to admit exists. Alina slowly turns toward him, and Damien's eyes flicker with something dangerously close to fear. Not fear of her leaving, but fear of what he feels when she tries to. He loosens his grip, but he doesn't let go entirely, as if releasing her would push them back into a coldness he is no longer able to survive. She whispers his name, unsure if she wants answers or distance, but before either of them can speak again, Damien abruptly steps back as if burned by the intensity between them, releasing her wrist with a force that feels like self-punishment. He mutters something unintelligible under his breath and walks away, retreating down the hall with shoulders tense, jaw tight, his entire body a contradiction of wanting her and fearing what wanting her means. Alina watches him disappear around the corner, her pulse thundering from the emotional whiplash of the night, then opens the door and leaves the penthouse with shaky steps, unsure if she's escaping him or abandoning something she never expected to start. Morning light hits her harsher than usual as she steps outside, the world feeling disjointed, unreal, as if everything she understood about Damien, about herself, shifted in the quiet hours of darkness. She keeps replaying the moment he grabbed her wrist, the way his voice cracked when he told her not to leave, the way his breath trembled as if he didn't recognize himself anymore. Alina tells herself it meant nothing, that he'll wake up angry at himself, angry at her, angry at the blurred lines between contract and connection. But her chest aches because she knows last night wasn't a mistake, not for her, and despite his denial, not for him either. She reaches home with a heart weighed down by confusion, forcing herself into her old routines, cooking for her mother, cleaning, pretending the world hasn't shifted beneath her feet. But even as she listens to her mother's soft breathing, even as she tries to focus on the simple tasks that once grounded her, her mind keeps drifting back to Damien's eyes. Those eyes that had always been guarded, cold, untouchable, now stripped open with a vulnerability she never expected to see. She tries to forget. She fails. Meanwhile, Damien sits alone in the penthouse, the room painfully silent except for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. He doesn't move for a long time. He doesn't drink, doesn't work, doesn't pretend to distract himself. He simply sits on the edge of the bed he shared with her, or tried not to share, or failed to resist sharing, staring at the imprint of her on the sheets, the faint warmth left behind, the scent of her skin still lingering on the pillow. He drags a hand through his hair, frustrated at himself, at her, at the world, at the contract that now feels like something twisted and meaningless because what he feels goes far beyond any agreement they signed. He can still feel her breath on his neck, hear the quiet sound she made when she whispered his name, remember the way her fingers clung to his arm when the tension finally broke between them. He swears under his breath because he knew better. He knew better than to let a woman close. He knew better than to blur lines. He knew better than to want something he can't control. But despite everything, he can't erase her from his mind. He presses his fingers to his forehead, eyes squeezed shut, realizing with a sharp, unwanted clarity that he doesn't regret a single second of last night. What terrifies him is that he wants more. Alina tries to distract herself by caring for her mother, but each time she catches her reflection, she sees the same shaken expression, the same confusion, the same ghost of Damien's touch lingering on her skin. She tells herself she's fine, that she can go on as if nothing happened, but her body betrays her. First with trembling hands she can't steady, then with sudden waves of fatigue that hit her out of nowhere, then with a nausea that has no explanation. She thinks it's stress. She thinks it's lack of food. She thinks it's the emotional weight pressing down on her chest. But when her vision blurs one afternoon while she's walking into a small clinic to pick up medicine for her mother, the world tilts sharply, the hallway spinning, the floor rising too quickly, and she collapses before she can call for help. When she wakes, the ceiling is white, and the sterile smell of the clinic fills her lungs. A doctor stands beside her with a worried expression, asking if she feels dizzy, if she has fainted before, if she has been under stress. Alina sits up slowly, shaking her head, insisting she's fine. But the doctor is persistent, telling her they ran a few tests while she was unconscious, just to be safe. Alina waits, expecting nothing more than a reminder to eat or rest, but the doctor's expression shifts subtly, not alarming but careful, cautious, as if she needs to prepare Alina for something that might shake her world. "Miss Alina," the doctor begins gently, "your results show something significant." Alina's heartbeat quickens, her mind racing with possibilities she isn't ready to face. The doctor continues, "You are pregnant." The words hit her like a violent jolt through her chest. She feels the air leave her lungs, her lips parting as if she's forgotten how to breathe. "Pregnant?" she whispers, almost unable to produce sound, her hands trembling so badly she has to grip the edge of the bed. The doctor nods, but before Alina can even begin to process the enormity of that revelation, before she can even whisper Damien's name in her thoughts, the doctor adds quietly, "And it is a twin pregnancy." Alina's entire world freezes. The shock, the fear, the disbelief twist inside her like a storm she cannot control. Her heart races so fast she thinks it might burst, and the room suddenly feels too small, too bright, too heavy. Her fingers clutch the bedsheet as she tries to steady herself, but nothing steadies because nothing in her life has ever shifted this fast, this drastically. Twin pregnancy, Damien's children, the consequence of one night she wasn't supposed to have. While she sits there stunned, the clinic door buzzes on the table beside her. Her phone lights up with an incoming call. She stares at the screen, her hands shaking, and when she finally lifts it to her ear, the breath she'd been holding breaks free at the sound of his voice, low, strained, confused, searching. "Alina, why did you disappear?" And the chapter snaps shut on that final shattering moment, his question hanging in the air while she sits in a clinic bed carrying twins he doesn't know exist yet. Alina sat frozen on the edge of the clinic bed, her hand still clutching the phone where Damien's voice had shaken her to the core. She couldn't bring herself to answer fully, couldn't risk speaking words that would pull him into the reality she was still too terrified to share. Her mind raced, a chaotic storm of fear, guilt, and desperation. If she told him, would he demand the contract be honored, dragging her back into the world she had fought to escape? Would he insist on taking the babies, asserting ownership in a way she could not yet bear? She couldn't let him. Not yet. Not while she still felt fragile, while her body and mind were still adjusting to the news that she carried not one, but two lives within her. So she feigned calm, pressed a trembling finger to the screen and whispered, I'm fine," though every part of her body screamed that she was anything but. Hanging up, she pressed her face into the blanket they had left behind at the penthouse, wishing she could hide from the world entirely, from him entirely, from the consequences of a night she had never intended to happen, but could never undo. The next days were a careful dance of avoidance. Alina disappeared into the routines of caring for her mother, visiting pharmacies, cooking, and attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Every sound of a car engine, every soft knock at the door made her heart hammer against her ribs. She checked her phone obsessively, expecting Damien's name to appear, dreading it at the same time. Each day stretched longer than the last. The walls of her apartment felt suffocating, the shadows in the corners of each room heavier, reminding her of the secret she couldn't yet voice. At night, she would sit quietly with the ultrasound image of her twins, tracing the shapes of their tiny forms with shaking fingers, tears slipping down her cheeks silently, wishing she could shield them from the world before they even entered it. For the first time in her life, she felt a bond so powerful, so consuming, that no contract, no money, no deal could erase it. These children, though yet unborn, felt like the only real, unshakable love she had ever known, but she could not hide forever. Damien, relentless as he was in everything he pursued, could not understand absence. For 2 weeks, he had grown restless, pacing his office late into the night, sending assistants to scour the city, tracking addresses, questioning everyone who had any connection to her. Yet Alina had been careful. No messages, no traceable movements, no patterns. He grew frustrated. He grew angry, though he did not understand why. Rage, panic, and an unfamiliar vulnerability twisted together inside him, tightening his chest and sharpening his focus. He hated not knowing. He hated losing control. And the thought that someone else, anything, could claim even a fraction of what he believed he owned, or at least deserved, gnawed at him. The world of Damien Cross had never felt so powerless. The collision was sudden and undeniable. She had gone to her mother's clinic early one morning, pale and exhausted, clutching her stomach as waves of nausea swept over her. She barely noticed the rain slicking the pavement outside, the cold chill sinking into her bones, until the door swung open with a force that startled her out of her fragile rhythm. Damien was there, standing tall, dripping with authority and unmistakable presence, yet his eyes immediately softened as they landed on her. He rushed forward instinctively, grabbing her shoulders with both hands, as though holding her in place might stop the world from collapsing entirely. "Alina, what happened? Who hurt you?" His voice was a mixture of fury, panic, and desperation, the cadence breaking in places where he couldn't quite control the emotions spilling out. Alina stumbled backward, instinctively recoiling from the intensity of his gaze, terrified that any slip could unravel everything she had tried to protect. She opened her mouth to speak, but words failed her, the weight of the secret pressed down so heavily that even breathing felt like a betrayal. Damien's eyes caught the medical file she had been clutching to her chest, the paper slipping slightly from her trembling fingers. His head snapped down to follow its descent, and in the instant it opened, his breath caught. The words "pregnancy" stared up at him in stark black letters. Time froze. The clinic walls, the muted hum of the fluorescent lights, the soft whispers of nurses passing by, all faded into a background blur as his entire focus narrowed to her, to the evidence in her hands, to the undeniable truth that rendered him speechless. His jaw dropped slightly, a rare, involuntary break in the control he always wielded so carefully. Alina froze, eyes wide, heart hammering. She knew what he was seeing, knew the reality of the situation was now unavoidable. And yet she could not meet his gaze. The truth of it, the implications of her actions, of the life she now carried, terrified her more than the fear of him, more than the fear of losing control, more than the fear of what this revelation might do to their fragile bond. She backed up instinctively, pressing herself against the wall, hands clutching the file like a lifeline, as Damien's presence became impossibly overwhelming. His voice dropped to a whisper, hoarse and nearly trembling. "Is it mine?" The words hung in the air like a threat, like a promise, like a plea, as if the entire world had contracted to the space between them. Alina's silence answered more loudly than words ever could, her wide eyes filled with fear, shame, and uncertainty. She wanted to speak, to deny, to explain, but the moment she opened her mouth, the room seemed to constrict around her, suffocating her with the intensity of Damien's stare. And as she stood there, frozen, Damien Cross, the man who had once been untouchable, cold, impenetrable, suddenly seemed like a man teetering on the edge of disbelief, panic, and a fear he didn't know how to name, a fear that she might vanish, a fear that what he already felt for her could unravel with one wrong word. The mini cliffhanger lingers. Alina can't breathe. Damien's hands twitch as if wanting to touch her, to protect, to claim, yet frozen by shock, and the entire room vibrates with the unspoken truth that neither of them is ready to face, but both are painfully aware exists. Nothing will ever be the same. 6. The moment Alina's silence confirmed the truth Damien had feared and hoped at the same time, a violent surge of panic swept through him, stronger than anything he had ever allowed himself to feel. He, the man who had meticulously controlled every aspect of his life, who had built walls so high that no woman had ever breached them, now found himself standing frozen, chest tight, hands clenched as if trying to physically restrain the storm raging inside him. The air around them seemed to thrum with tension, every second stretching impossibly long, charged with the electricity of what had just been revealed. He stared at her, at the undeniable proof she held in trembling hands, and the world around him contracted to a single, sharp, unrelenting thought. He could not lose her. Not now, not ever, and certainly not the children she carried within her. Alina's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, staring down at the floor, tears blurring the lines of her vision. Her voice, soft and quivering, attempted to assert control over a situation she could not contain. I won't force you. You don't have to do anything. I'll raise them alone." Her words, meant to protect Damien, meant to shield him from the responsibility, tore through him like a knife. For the first time in his life, Damien's composure shattered completely. His hand shot out, slamming against the wall with a force that rattled the picture frames and echoed harshly in the otherwise silent room. "You think you can walk out with my children and I'll just watch?" His voice was raw, unfiltered, a mixture of fury, panic, and something deeper, more primal, that startled even him. The strength in his tone, the desperation threading through it, made Alina step back instinctively, heart pounding, yet she could see through his fury into the vulnerability beneath. The fear that terrified him even more than her anger or disappointment ever could. Damien's fingers flexed against the wall, white-knuckled, and he tried to draw in a slow, controlled breath, attempting to calm himself, to regain the composure that had always defined him, yet every attempt failed miserably. His fear showed in the quiver of his jaw, the sharp rise and fall of his chest, the way his eyes searched her face desperately for a sign she might understand him, that she might not leave him alone with the reality he had never anticipated, that he loved her, that he feared losing her, that he wanted more than a contract. More than control, he wanted her. Alina, still trembling, tried to take a step toward the door, to retreat from the storm she had accidentally ignited, to reclaim the fragile safety she thought she had by keeping her secret. But Damien's voice stopped her, low, breaking, shaking with an honesty he had never allowed anyone to hear. "I don't want the contract anymore. I want you." The words reverberated in the room, stronger than any argument, more binding than any contract ever could be, and Alina froze, the implications of his declaration cutting through her carefully constructed defenses. She wanted to speak, to protest, to remind him that the circumstances were complex, that the children were still fragile, that her heart was still uncertain, but no words could form in the churning storm of emotions between them. The intensity of the moment, the overwhelming reality of Damien's confession, was broken abruptly by a sudden, terrifying sound, a soft, collapsing thud from behind them. Both of them turned instinctively, hearts jumping. Alina's mother, standing weakly in the background after checking on something in the next room, had suddenly collapsed onto the floor, her hand pressed to her chest, eyes rolling slightly as panic surged through Alina's veins like liquid fire. She rushed forward, voice shaking as she called out, "Mom! Mom!" while Damien moved with impossible speed, lifting her mother into his arms with a strength that belied his panic, his expression sharpening into razor-like focus. The world contracted again. The chaos of emotions, the fear for the children, the fear for Alina, all interweaving into a single, urgent thread. Nothing else mattered but the life lying helpless in Damien's grasp. Alina's mind raced, each second loaded with adrenaline and terror, while Damien barked orders under his breath, speaking into his phone to summon an emergency response, his usual calm efficiency returning in bursts, but not fully masking the panic flaring behind his eyes. "Get the car ready," he said harshly, voice clipped but trembling. "Now, no mistakes." His hand never left Alina's mother's body as he lifted her carefully, checking her pulse, adjusting her head, murmuring softly for her to stay awake, stay with them. While Alina followed, unable to move quickly enough, heart in her throat, tears streaming unchecked as she realized how fragile their world had become in a single moment. Every movement, every breath, every passing second was a razor-sharp balance between life and death, hope and terror. The ambulance arrived, lights flashing, and Damien stayed at his mother's side, refusing to step away even as trained paramedics took over, his hand gripping hers with a quiet ferocity, his eyes never leaving Alina's, silently transmitting his promise that he would not abandon her or her family or the children growing inside her. Alina could feel the weight of his presence, the intensity of his gaze burning into her, and in that moment she realized the contract no longer mattered. It had never mattered. What mattered was the raw, undeniable bond that had grown between them, unspoken yet irreversible, fragile yet indestructible. As the paramedics loaded her mother into the ambulance, Damien turned to Alina, his voice low, thick with emotion he could no longer hide. "I am not leaving your side. I am not letting anything happen to you, to them, to this family. Not if I can stop it." Alina's chest heaved with relief, fear, and a flicker of hope she hadn't dared to allow herself before. She wanted to speak, to reassure him, to beg him not to push himself too hard, but the tears, the adrenaline, the overwhelming mix of fear and love choked her words. Damien took her hand, gripping it like he could anchor both of them against the chaos of the world, and in that fierce, unyielding grasp, Alina finally understood. Whatever storms lay ahead, he would not let go. And the chapter ends on that tense, unrelenting note. Damien refusing to leave her side. Alina holding on to the man who had shattered her world, yet promised to protect it. The twins growing inside her, unknown to him but entirely theirs already, a secret yet to be fully revealed, poised to change everything. Emergency lights flashing in the night as they raced toward the hospital, hearts pounding in unison, the air thick with fear, desire, and an unbreakable bond neither of them can deny. The sterile scent of the hospital hallways had never felt so suffocating, so heavy, so impossibly alive, as Damien's shadow stretched along the linoleum floor beside her mother's emergency room. Alina trailed behind him, heart thundering against her ribs, eyes tracing his every movement. He had become a tempest she could neither predict nor contain. Fists clenched, jaw tight, pacing with a rhythm that mirrored the relentless storm brewing in his mind. Every few steps, his hands would twitch, fingers curling, unclenching, as if trying to grab hold of some invisible thread to tether himself to reason. His eyes, usually so cold, so calculating, were storm clouds themselves, dark and roiling with emotions he'd spent years hiding from the world and from himself. Alina followed silently, her own chest caught in the swirl of panic and fear, trying not to disturb the fragile balance of control he had not yet reclaimed, yet understanding that he was utterly incapable of staying still, of letting go. Minutes bled into hours as Damien hovered near her mother's bed, every movement a demonstration of silent vigilance. He questioned every nurse, every doctor, every assistant, absorbing information at a speed that made Alina dizzy. He repeated the same questions, pacing the floor with an energy that bordered on obsession, and Alina could not help but notice the subtle tremor in his hands when the doctor approached with updates. Each update, each reassurance, each confirmation that her mother was stabilizing should have been relief enough, but instead, Alina felt a deep, visceral trembling beneath the surface, because Damien's reaction revealed far more than his words ever would. The man who had once sworn never to let anyone touch the corners of his heart was unraveling, and she was watching, powerless, yet drawn into his intensity like a moth to flame. When the attending physician finally emerged from the operating room, Alina held her breath. The moment his words cut through the tension, "Your mother will survive." Her body reacted before her mind could even process it. Her knees buckled, her arms weakened, and she felt the world tilt as if gravity had shifted in sudden, shocking clarity. Damien's reflex was instantaneous. He caught her before she could collapse to the floor, his strong arms a tether between the chaos of the hospital and the fragile certainty of her safety. his chest pressed against hers, and for a moment Alina could feel the rapid, irregular beat of his heart pounding directly against her own, a rhythm of fear, relief, and an emotion she was only beginning to recognize. Why are you doing all this?" she asked, voice trembling, words nearly swallowed by the rapid pulse of adrenaline, fear, and something unspoken between them. Damien's throat tightened as he stepped back slightly, eyes blazing into hers, a storm of unshed emotion contained behind the perfect veneer of his control. His voice, low and raw, carried an honesty that was almost unbearable. "Because I'm tired of pretending I don't care." The words sliced through Alina's carefully built walls, leaving her exposed in the most intimate, terrifying way. She wanted to respond, to tell him that she understood, that she was just as terrified as he was, that the truth of their bond scared her more than anything. But the intensity of his gaze froze her in place. Every muscle in her body tightened, pulled in all directions as if the world had narrowed down to the space between them, every heartbeat counting down seconds of both fear and longing. The ride home was silent but charged. Damien had taken her mother's side in the ambulance, refusing to release her grip on her hand, as if letting go would shatter everything he had come to realize he could no longer live without. Alina's mind raced with the implications. The children growing inside her, the bond between her and Damien, the impossible tenderness that had begun to seep into the spaces he had always kept sterile and unreachable. At their apartment, he insisted on carrying her bags, refusing to allow her to move quickly, his movements deliberate, careful, protective, yet not overbearing, an entirely new Damien, one who lived in the tension between authority and vulnerability, between desire and restraint, between fear and hope. Later that evening, Damien insisted on cooking. Alina watched, hands pressed against her stomach instinctively as he clumsily attempted to chop vegetables and stir the pot of soup with a focus that bordered on obsession. She couldn't stop herself from laughing, a laugh long buried beneath months of anxiety and tension, at the awkwardness of his movements, the furrowed brow, the way he muttered under his breath with concentration that made him almost human, almost approachable. Damien paused, eyes locking onto hers, as if seeing the laughter illuminated a light he had long forgotten existed. The softness in her expression hit him like sunlight, piercing through storm clouds he had built for himself over years, leaving him momentarily breathless, unarmed, and exposed. For a few fleeting moments, the world softened. Alina felt a warmth in the apartment she hadn't felt in months, a fragile peace in the midst of chaos. Damien's gaze lingered on her, unblinking, intense, as if committing every line of her face, every glint in her eyes, every movement to memory. She realized then, with a sudden clarity, that this man, this impossible, cold, controlling, magnificent man, was no longer untouchable. He had begun to care in a way that scared him more than it should have, and terrified her in equal measure. But just as the edges of the night softened and the air seemed safe, the delicate balance shattered. A knock on the door, firm, deliberate, unavoidable, sent a jolt through Alina. She froze, eyes wide, sensing instinctively that this was no ordinary visitor. Damien's body tensed instantly, hands tightening on the counter, jaw clenched, every muscle coiling as though anticipating a threat. The door swung open, and there she was, Cassandra, Damien's ex-fiancée, radiating cold authority and a familiarity that made Alina's stomach twist with unease. Her eyes flicked to Damien, assessing, calculating, as if she had been planning this moment for months. "We need to talk. Now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument, no room for hesitation. Damien's eyes darkened instantly, a storm gathering behind them, and Alina instinctively took a step back, her pulse hammering. She could feel the tension in the room spike, every subtle movement between them charged with unspoken histories, threats, and betrayals that had nothing to do with her, but everything to do with the man she had come to care for. Her hand went to her stomach without thinking, and in that subtle gesture, Cassandra's eyes narrowed. Damien's body stiffened, protective and alert, and in that instant, Alina understood fully. The fragile peace she had tasted for even a few hours was gone, and the battle for his heart, for their future, for the safety of the lives inside her, was about to become far more complicated than she had ever imagined. And the chapter ends on that knife edge of suspense. Damien facing the woman who once almost claimed him entirely, Alina caught in the middle, and a storm of emotion, history, and desire waiting just beyond the threshold, threatening to change everything once again. The door stands between them, a literal and symbolic line, and nothing, not even their fragile bond, will remain untouched. The instant Cassandra stepped into the penthouse, the air seemed to thicken, charged with a tension that made Alina's skin prickle and her pulse race. She felt Damien stiffen immediately, every muscle in his body coiling like a predator, sensing a threat. Cassandra's eyes glinted with the cold confidence of someone who had once been close enough to him to understand his patterns, his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities, and she wielded that knowledge like a weapon. Alina instinctively moved closer to the kitchen counter, her back pressing against the marble, hands gripping the edge as though it could anchor her in the storm about to erupt. Cassandra's voice was smooth, controlled, yet sharp enough to cut through the faint hum of the penthouse lights. "Helping her, Damien. Tell me the truth. You're only doing this out of guilt. Admit it. You never cared for her. She's just a convenient mistake." Damien's eyes, dark and stormy, met hers with a ferocity that made Alina flinch. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, thick and tense, until Cassandra's smirk began to falter. Then he spoke, every word heavy, absolute, and unyielding. "I've never felt for you what I feel for her." The words landed like a hammer blow. Cassandra's confident posture faltered for the first time, a flicker of shock crossing her face. But it was the tremor in Alina's chest, the sudden tightening of her stomach, that made the room feel impossibly small. Hearing him claim such unequivocal devotion should have filled her with relief, with joy, yet it didn't. Instead, her heart constricted with fear, a cold, visceral dread that love, the kind Damien was now daring to feel, meant vulnerability. Love meant exposure. And Alina had already lost too much. She had been discarded before, betrayed, humiliated, and now even the promise of love carried the weight of everything she feared to feel again. Cassandra, recovering from the initial shock, leaned closer, her tone dropping into venomous insistence. "You're lying to yourself. You don't love her. You never could. You're just trying to ease your conscience. She's young, naive, fragile. She doesn't know what she's caught herself in. You're using her. Don't forget that." Alina felt her stomach twist, her hand pressing over her own chest as if she could shield herself from the truth of Cassandra's words. And yet, the look Damien shot Cassandra was sharper than any weapon, colder than the fiercest winter wind. His eyes burned with a controlled fury that made Alina's chest constrict even further. Every fiber of his being screamed that he would not allow anyone, not Cassandra, not fate, not circumstance, to dictate the truth of what he felt. Cassandra's smirk vanished completely now, replaced by a mixture of disbelief and irritation. She stormed toward the door, dragging one final poisoned whisper after her, a knife aimed directly at Alina's heart. "He'll destroy you. Men like him always do." The words lingered in the room like a shadow, sinking into Alina's chest and twisting around her heart, reopening every old wound, every fear she had tried to bury. Her knees weakened, her hands shaking as she pressed her fingers to her lips to keep from crying out. Every memory of betrayal, of rejection, of losing control, converged with Cassandra's venomous words and made her feel the fragility of her own position. Pregnant, alone, and caught in a storm she could neither predict nor control. As the door closed behind Cassandra, the silence in the penthouse was suffocating. Damien's posture remained rigid, jaw clenched, but Alina could feel the trembling in the air, the residual tension, the unspoken battle raging between him and the past he could not yet fully silence. She realized then, with a sudden, stark clarity, that no matter how much Damien tried to shield her, how much he claimed he cared, the world, or people like Cassandra, would not let her feel safe. The promise of love had never felt so heavy, so dangerous, and so profoundly complicated. That night, Alina moved silently through the penthouse, her mind a whirlwind of fear, anger, and desperate clarity. She packed a bag with care, each item placed deliberately, as though she could arrange the pieces of her escape to form some semblance of control. Her hands shook slightly as she folded clothes, packed small necessities for herself and the twins she carried, and wrote a note she hoped would explain everything without truly revealing the depth of her terror. On a small piece of paper she wrote simply, "Thank you for everything, but I won't let my babies grow up in a war they didn't create." The words, though measured, carried the weight of her soul, a fragile hope that perhaps she could protect them, protect herself, from the chaos surrounding Damien and the life he now wanted to claim as his own. Alina left before dawn, her bag slung over her shoulder, careful to make no noise, careful to erase every trace of her presence. Every step down the marble staircase, every cautious turn of the doorknob, every beat of her heart felt amplified in the silence of the early morning. She had convinced herself she was acting rationally, protecting her children, shielding them from the storm that Damien's world inevitably brought with it. But as the penthouse door clicked shut behind her, a cold dread settled over her, the creeping realization that escaping him would not be as simple as leaving. Damien returned later that morning, expecting the calm, the familiar presence of Alina. But the apartment was empty. His eyes scanned the bed, landing on the small folded note resting precisely where she had left it. The moment his gaze fell upon it, his face drained of color. Rage and fear mingled into a perfect storm, twisting his gut into knots, his pulse racing as if the blood could burn a path straight to his head. He snatched the note, reading her words with a growing sense of disbelief, anguish, and fury that he had ever let her leave his side. He dropped the paper onto the floor, eyes blazing as he roared into the empty penthouse. "Alina!" The sound echoed off the walls, reverberating with the weight of his broken control, his unbridled love, and his desperate need to find her. Every echo of his voice carried the promise that he would not relent, that he would not allow her to disappear from his life, that he would pursue her across any distance, through any obstacle, to claim what he now knew could not be denied. The empty apartment seemed to vibrate with the intensity of his presence, the air thick with the raw power of his rage, his grief, his fear, and above all, his relentless love. "I will find you," he whispered, his voice hoarse but unwavering, almost to himself, almost to the walls that had witnessed every secret, every stolen moment, every ounce of his growing vulnerability. "And you will come home." The chapter ends suspended in a breathless tension. Alina, far from the penthouse, carrying secrets, carrying life, carrying fear, moving into an unknown future. Damien in the empty apartment, consumed by rage and love, vowing to find her, and the silent, storm-laden world between them, waiting for the next collision that would determine everything. Alina's car hummed quietly along the narrow coastal road, the engine's low growl barely audible over the crash of distant waves. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with a trembling intensity she could not control, knuckles white, heart hammering as though it were trying to escape her chest. Each glance at the rearview mirror made her flinch, half expecting to see Damien's familiar, storm-darkened eyes staring back at her, filled with the relentless intensity that had haunted her every thought since leaving the penthouse. She had thought she could find peace in this small town, nestled against the cliffs, far from the skyscrapers, the chaos, and the man whose presence had become the axis of her world. Yet, no matter how far she drove, no matter how many streets she memorized, she could not erase the memory of him. The way his hand had felt over hers, the way his heartbeat had thumped against her cheek, the way his voice had trembled with unspoken desire, fear, and love. She had left to protect herself and the twins growing within her, but each mile she put between them tightened the invisible chain that connected them. The town was quiet, a sleepy coastal village where seagulls cried overhead and the wind carried the scent of salt and driftwood. Alina parked near the cliffs, the same spot she had found days ago while exploring, a place where the ocean stretched endlessly, wild and untamed, mirroring the chaos in her chest. She stepped out of the car slowly, feeling the grass crunch beneath her feet, and walked toward the edge, every step measured, as though distance could shield her from the inevitable. But even here, alone with the wind whipping around her and the waves crashing far below, she could not escape the truth. She missed Damien with a ferocity that terrified her. Each heartbeat carried his name, each breath whispered it, and despite herself, despite every promise she had made to protect her children and herself, she longed for him more than she dared to admit. Meanwhile, Damien Cross was tearing across the country with the precision of a man obsessed, leaving nothing unturned, nothing unchecked. His empire had been designed to function without him, yet even in its seamless operation, his mind never left the thought of Alina. Every boardroom meeting, every negotiation, every phone call was punctuated with her image, her scent lingering in his memory, her trembling hands replaying in the quiet moments. He had sent teams, private investigators, and even his closest associates to scour every possible location where she might hide. And yet he had known deep down that no one could find her until he did. He had followed the trail only he could trace, the subtle patterns, the instincts that no one else could perceive, because he knew her in a way that went far beyond any ordinary knowledge. When he finally arrived at the cliffs overlooking the ocean, he saw her, standing at the precipice of both the world and her own fear, and time seemed to halt. Alina froze the moment she sensed him, the hair on the back of her neck rising as though it were being whispered to by an invisible presence. She did not turn immediately, fearing that if she did, the sight of him would shatter all her defenses. And yet, there was no anger in his approach, no accusation in his stance. He walked toward her slowly, deliberately, with a restraint that only heightened the tension, the unspoken storm beneath his calm exterior. "You ran from me," he said quietly, voice carrying the weight of longing and heartbreak, not anger, not because you feared me, but because you started loving me. The words hit her like lightning, illuminating every corner of her soul she had tried to keep hidden. Her eyes filled with tears she could not control, streaming down her face, betraying the silence she had maintained so fiercely. Damien stopped a few paces away, the wind whipping around them, the ocean a roaring symphony beneath the cliffs. He knelt suddenly, almost reverently, placing his hands gently on her belly, cupping it with a tenderness that made her chest tighten with emotions she had been denying herself. "I want all three of you," he whispered, voice trembling despite the control he usually exuded, "not as responsibility, as my family." The confession, raw and unguarded, broke something inside Alina. She had tried to protect herself, tried to preserve her independence, tried to shield her children from the man whose love could burn and heal in equal measure. But hearing him speak these words, feeling his hand so carefully, so intentionally placed, shattered the walls she had built around her heart. Her knees weakened, tears streaming freely now as she collapsed toward him, and he caught her without hesitation. Her forehead rested against his chest, and for the first time since she had left, Alina allowed herself to surrender fully to the fear, to the longing, to the undeniable truth of their bond. Damien held her tightly, breathing her in, memorizing the tremor of her body, the warmth of her skin, the life growing within her, and it all became more than he had ever imagined possible. In that instant, there was no contract, no fear, no world outside the cliffside, only the two of them, entwined, hearts and souls colliding, raw and unfiltered. After a long, shuddering silence, Damien lifted her chin, his hands tracing the line of her jaw, cupping her face with a reverence that spoke of devotion, of desperation, of promises he had never dared to utter to anyone else. His eyes searched hers, dark and endless, and he spoke the words he had once believed he could never say to anyone. "Alina, marry me." The wind gusted sharply, carrying the sound of crashing waves, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for her answer. Alina's lips trembled, tears sliding down her cheeks, as her heart beat so rapidly she feared it might escape her chest. She could see in his eyes every fear, every longing, every vulnerability he had so carefully hidden, and she realized that nothing, not distance, not fear, not past betrayals, could separate them now. The ocean roared below, a perfect mirror to the storm of emotion within them, as Damien waited, kneeling, utterly vulnerable and utterly devoted. Alina's breath came in shuddering gasps, her tears soaking the collar of his shirt as she realized she had been running from the wrong thing all along. She had feared losing herself, losing control, losing her children. Yet in that fear, she had failed to see the one truth that mattered. Damien had never wanted control. He had wanted her, and only her, all along. She reached a trembling hand to his face, fingers brushing against his temple, feeling the warmth, the pulse, the undeniable reality of him, and the realization struck her like sunlight piercing through storm clouds. She loved him, with every fiber of her being, and nothing could erase that. Damien rose slowly, never breaking eye contact, cupping her face with both hands now, sealing the space between them with the gravity of his presence. The world around them, the wind, the waves, the cliffs, the past, the pain, all melted into insignificance, leaving only the certainty of their love, their shared future, and the life growing inside her. "Alina," he whispered again, softer this time, as if saying her name could forge reality into something perfect, something eternal. "Marry me." Her lips parted, breath shaking, tears blurring her vision, and in that suspended moment, everything she had feared, everything she had protected against, everything she had endured, crystallized into one undeniable truth. Damien was hers, she was his, and the three lives they were about to build together would be forged in love, passion, and an unbreakable bond. She did not answer immediately, letting the waves crash, the wind whip, and the world pause around them, savoring the gravity of the moment. Her silence was not hesitation. It was awe. It was surrender. It was the full weight of what they had survived and what they were about to embrace. And in that silence, Damien leaned closer, pressing his forehead to hers, letting the warmth of their shared breath bridge the space that had once seemed insurmountable. The cliffside, the ocean, the wind, and the sky bore witness to the unspoken promise forming between them, that no force, no betrayal, no fear could ever separate them again. In that instant, time seemed to fold, bending reality around their love, their future, their family. And as the waves crashed behind them, as the wind howled and whipped at their hair, as the sun began its slow descent, the chapter and their story ended on a perfect note of raw, unfiltered, unshakable love, leaving only the anticipation of the life they would now build together. Wow. What an intense story. If this had you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear how you felt about every twist and turn. Don't forget to subscribe to Beyond Color Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that will steal your heart and keep you hooked. Remember, the story doesn't end here. There's so much more drama, romance, and suspense coming your way. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.